Are you ready for a spine-chilling story that will keep you on the edge of your seat? Join me on Midnight Murmurs as we explore the dark secrets of a small town in Maine. In my new book, The Shadows Within, a retired detective moves to town with his family, only to uncover a sinister presence lurking in the shadows. Follow along as we delve into the mystery and horror that awaits in this classic tale. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories like this. The Shadows Within. Chapter 1: The New Town. The drive from the city was long and tiring. The protagonist, John, and his family had been on the road for hours, and they were all exhausted. But as they approached their new home in the small Maine town, John couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. It was a beautiful place, with quaint houses and friendly people. It was the perfect place to start a new life. As they pulled up to their new home, John couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. The house was old, but it had character. It was surrounded by trees, and there was a peacefulness in the air that John had never experienced before. After they settled in, John decided to take a walk around the town to get a feel for the place. As he walked, he noticed that something seemed off. There was a tension in the air, and the people he passed seemed to be on edge. He tried to ignore it, but it nagged at him. Later that day, John visited the local diner and struck up a conversation with the owner. The owner told him that there had been a series of strange disappearances in the town over the past few months. People were vanishing without a trace, and no one knew why. John couldn't believe it. He had moved his family to a town where people were disappearing? He tried to push the thought out of his mind, but it kept coming back. As he went to bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister lurking in the shadows of the town. Chapter 2: The Disappearances Begin. The day started like any other day in the small town of Haven, Maine. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the townspeople were going about their daily business. But little did they know that this day would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them for years to come. It all started when a young boy named Tommy went missing. He was last seen playing in the park with his friends, but when they went to look for him, he was nowhere to be found. The town's police department was notified, and a search party was quickly organized. But as the hours passed, and there was still no sign of Tommy, the townspeople began to worry. As the days went by, more and more people started to disappear. First, it was Tommy's neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. Then it was a group of teenagers who went hiking in the woods. And soon, it seemed like every other day, another person was gone. The town was in a state of panic. Parents wouldn't let their children out of their sight, and the streets were deserted after dark. The police investigation turned up nothing, and the rumors started to spread about a sinister presence lurking in the shadows. But as the weeks turned into months, the disappearances became more frequent, and the townspeople became more desperate for answers. It was as if the town was cursed, and nobody was safe. And so, the people of Haven, Maine, lived in fear, waiting for the next disappearance to occur. But little did they know that there was one man who was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. A retired detective who had just moved to town with his family. a man who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth behind the shadows that lurked within the town of Haven. Chapter 3: The Detective's Obsession. John was a man on a mission. He had always been the kind of person who needed a purpose, and now he had found it. The disappearances in the town had taken hold of his mind, and he couldn't stop thinking about them. He spent his days poring over police reports, talking to witnesses, and looking for any clues he could find. It was a calming routine for John, the sense of purpose and the feeling that he was making progress. But it was also unsettling, the idea that something sinister was lurking in the shadows of the town. As he investigated, he began to notice strange occurrences and eerie coincidences that only added to his obsession. John's wife, Mary, started to worry about him. He was neglecting his family and his health, staying up late at night researching and becoming more and more fixated on the case. But John couldn't help himself. He knew that there was something more to the disappearances, and he was determined to find out what it was. As the days went by, John's obsession with the case began to take a toll on his mental and physical health. He became increasingly agitated and paranoid, convinced that he was being watched and followed. He started to see shadows in every corner, and the sounds of the night became more ominous and threatening. Despite his wife's pleas and warnings from other residents in the town, John refused to back down. He was convinced that he was getting closer to the truth, and he couldn't let go of the case. His obsession had taken over his life, and he was willing to do anything to solve the mystery of the disappearances. Chapter 4: The Dark History of the Town. The detective couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this town. As he began his investigation, he quickly discovered that the disappearances were not the first strange occurrence in the area. Digging through old archives and dusty tomes, he uncovered a dark history that had been buried for centuries. The town had been founded in the early 1600s by a group of Puritans fleeing religious persecution in England. They had settled in the area and quickly established a strict, conservative community. However, as the years went by, their beliefs became more extreme, and they began to persecute those who didn't conform to their strict standards. As the detective continued to read, he realized that the disappearances may be linked to a series of executions that took place in the late 1600s. The Puritans had accused several of their own of witchcraft and put them to death, convinced that they were in league with the devil. The detective shuddered as he read the gruesome details of the executions. The accused had been burned at the stake, drowned, or hanged, depending on the severity of their alleged crimes. He couldn't help but wonder if the evil that had possessed the town all those years ago was still present, lurking in the shadows and preying on the unsuspecting residents. As he closed the old tome and put it back on the shelf, the detective couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He knew that he was getting closer to the truth, but at what cost? He was afraid that the ancient evil that had plagued the town for centuries might now be targeting him and his family. The detective vowed to continue his investigation, no matter the risk. He knew that the only way to save the town and his loved ones was to uncover the truth and confront the darkness head-on. Chapter 5: The Sinister Presence. The detective begins to suspect that there is a sinister presence lurking in the shadows. The detective couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the town of Millfield. He had seen strange things, heard eerie whispers in the darkness, and felt a malevolent force watching his every move. It was as if there was a presence lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. One evening, as he walked home from the diner, he heard a rustling in the bushes behind him. He turned around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The rustling grew louder and more frantic, and he started to run. Suddenly, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he screamed, spinning around to face his attacker. But there was no one there. The street was deserted, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets. The detective knew that he was being watched. He could feel eyes on him everywhere he went, and he saw strange shapes out of the corner of his eye. He began to suspect that there was a sinister presence lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. As he investigated the disappearances more closely, he found evidence that seemed to support his suspicions. There were whispers of a demon, a ghost, or a cursed spirit that had been unleashed by an ancient ritual. The detective was skeptical, but he knew that he couldn't ignore the evidence. He started to delve deeper, piecing together the clues, and soon he began to see the truth. There was something evil in Millfield, something that had been lurking in the shadows for centuries. And it was getting closer. Chapter 6: The Reluctant Sheriff. The detective had hit a roadblock in his investigation. The sheriff of the small Maine town had refused to assist him, convinced that the detective was wasting his time and resources. The detective tried to explain the situation to the sheriff, but he wouldn't listen. Frustrated, the detective decided to take matters into his own hands. He began to investigate on his own, searching for clues and interviewing witnesses. However, every time he thought he had made progress, he hit a dead end. The townspeople were reluctant to talk, and the sheriff was actively working against him. The detective felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. Despite the setbacks, the detective refused to give up. He knew that there was something sinister going on in the town, and he was determined to uncover the truth. As he continued his investigation, he discovered that the sheriff had a personal stake in the situation. The sheriff had lost a family member to the disappearances years ago and was still grieving. The detective approached the sheriff again, this time with a different approach. He sympathized with the sheriff's loss and explained that he understood why he was hesitant to get involved. But he also pointed out that the disappearances were still happening, and they needed to work together to solve the case and prevent further tragedy. To the detective's surprise, the sheriff agreed to help. Together, they began to piece together the clues, and as they worked together, they began to build a mutual respect for each other. The detective realized that the sheriff was not reluctant because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. By the end of the chapter, the detective and the sheriff had made progress in their investigation, and they were one step closer to uncovering the truth about the shadows within the town. Chapter 7: The first clue. The detective discovers a clue that may lead him to the source of the evil. The detective sat alone in his living room, poring over the evidence he had gathered so far. The disappearances had been weighing heavily on his mind, and he knew he had to find a lead soon. As he sifted through the files, his eye caught on a detail he had missed before. A name, repeated in several witness statements. He sat up straighter, heart racing. Could this be the first real clue he had found? He rushed to his computer and began scouring the internet for information on the name. It was a long shot, but he had to try. Hours passed as he dug deeper and deeper until finally he hit upon something. A newspaper article from years ago detailing a bizarre incident in the town's history. It involved the same name he had been researching, and it described strange occurrences that had taken place in a remote location outside of town. The detective's pulse quickened as he read on. He had never heard of this incident before, and the details were unsettling. But it was a lead, and he knew he had to follow it. The next day, he set out for the location described in the article. As he drove deeper into the woods, he felt a growing sense of unease. The trees seemed to press in around him, and the air grew thick and oppressive. Finally, he reached the spot described in the article. It was an old cabin, long abandoned and overgrown with vines. As he approached, he felt a chill run down his spine. This was it. The source of the evil that had been plaguing the town. The detective took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Chapter 8: The Old Cemetery. The old cemetery was located on the outskirts of town, hidden away among the trees. The detective had heard rumors that it was a haunted place and that strange things happened there at night. But he had never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. On this particular day, the detective made his way to the cemetery, determined to find evidence that would support his theory. He walked among the gravestones, scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. He noticed that some of the older graves had been dug up, their contents long since removed. As he walked, he noticed a faint odor in the air. It was a sickly sweet smell, like rotting flowers. He followed the scent to a large, overgrown plot of land in the center of the cemetery. There, he found what he had been looking for. The ground had been disturbed, and there were signs that something had been recently dug up. The detective knelt down and began to dig, using his bare hands. He uncovered a small wooden box, its lid barely attached. Inside the box were several old documents, their edges yellowed with age. The detective quickly scanned through them, his heart racing. They were written in an ancient language, but he could make out a few words here and there. The documents confirmed his suspicions. The ancient evil that had been buried beneath the town for centuries was real, and it had been awakened. The disappearances were just the beginning. The detective carefully put the documents back in the box and reburied it. He knew that he had to act quickly if he was going to stop the evil from spreading any further. He made his way back to his car, his mind racing with ideas. As he drove back to his house, the detective couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him. He finally had the evidence he needed to stop the evil and save the town. He felt like he was finally getting closer to the truth, and that was a comforting feeling. Little did he know, the evil was already aware of his presence and was watching his every move. The detective was playing a dangerous game, but he was determined to see it through to the end. Chapter 9: The Ancient Evil. The detective's research led him to the local historical society, where he met an elderly librarian named Mrs. Winslow. She was a sweet woman with silver hair and glasses that rested on the bridge of her nose. The detective explained his findings to her, and she nodded gravely, as if she already knew what he was going to say. "The ancient evil," she said softly, "has been here for centuries. It is older than the town itself, older than anything you can imagine." She led him to a dimly lit back room filled with dusty tomes and old manuscripts. She pulled out a leather-bound book and handed it to him. "This is the town's history," she said. "It goes back to the 1600s. Maybe you'll find what you're looking for in there." The detective flipped through the pages, skimming over the familiar names and events until he came to a section about the town's founding. The text was written in an archaic style that was difficult to read, but he managed to make out the words. According to the book, the town was founded by a group of Puritan settlers who were fleeing persecution in England. They chose the spot because of its natural resources, but also because of the darkness that lurked beneath the earth. They believed that the devil himself had a stronghold in the area, and that the land was cursed. The detective's heart quickened as he read on. He learned that the settlers had made a pact with the devil, promising to sacrifice their firstborn children in exchange for prosperity and protection. The devil had agreed, and the settlers had thrived. But over time, the devil grew greedy. He demanded more and more sacrifices until the town was nearly empty. The settlers realized too late that they had made a terrible mistake. They tried to break the pact, but it was too late. The devil had already claimed the town as his own. The detective closed the book and sat in stunned silence. He had uncovered a dark secret that had been buried for centuries. The evil that was lurking in the shadows of the town was not just a random occurrence, but a curse that had been placed on the town by its founders. He knew that he had to act quickly if he wanted to stop the evil from spreading. He thanked Mrs. Winslow and left the Historical Society, determined to find a way to defeat the ancient evil that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. Chapter 10: The Race Against Time. The detective's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood in the abandoned church, surrounded by darkness. He knew that he was running out of time to stop the ancient evil that threatened to destroy the town. His mind was racing as he tried to come up with a plan, but the enormity of the task at hand was overwhelming. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes and tried to focus. He needed to stay calm and clear-headed if he was going to save the town and his family. Slowly, an idea began to form in his mind, and he opened his eyes with renewed determination. He raced back to his house and grabbed the few weapons he had managed to scavenge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town. He knew he needed to act fast. As he ran through the streets, the detective could feel the weight of the ancient evil bearing down on him. He could hear the whispers in the shadows, and the sense of impending doom was almost suffocating. Reaching the town square, the detective found the entrance to the underground tunnels where the evil was lurking. Without hesitation, he descended into the darkness, his weapons at the ready. The tunnels were labyrinthine, and the detective soon found himself hopelessly lost. The shadows seemed to be closing in on him, and he could hear the sounds of ancient rituals echoing through the tunnels. But he pressed on, driven by the thought of his family and the town he had come to love. Finally, he reached the heart of the ancient evil, where he was faced with a final, terrifying challenge. With a deep breath, the detective confronted the evil head-on. The battle was long and brutal, but the detective emerged victorious, banishing the ancient evil back to the depths of the earth. Exhausted and bruised, the detective emerged from the tunnels to find the first rays of dawn illuminating the town. He had saved the day, and he knew that the town would never be the same. As he walked through the streets, he saw the first signs of life returning to normal. Children playing, shopkeepers opening their doors, and the sounds of everyday life returning to the town. The detective knew that he had done the right thing, and that the town was now safe from the shadows within. Chapter 11, The Final Showdown. The detective confronts the evil and engages in a final showdown. The air was thick with the stench of decay as the detective made his way down into the ancient underground chamber. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled with fear and excitement. He knew that this was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He had come face to face with the ancient evil that had been terrorizing the town for so long. The chamber was dark and oppressive, but the detective could see a faint glow in the distance. He moved forward, the light growing brighter with each step. As he reached the source of the light, he saw the ancient creature for the first time. It was a monster unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its body was covered in a thick, slimy layer of skin, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Its tentacles writhed and squirmed, each one ending in a razor-sharp claw. The detective drew his gun, his hands shaking as he aimed at the monster. "You've caused enough pain and suffering," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "It's time for you to pay for your crimes." The monster let out a bone-chilling screech and lunged forward, its tentacles slashing through the air. The detective dodged to the side, firing his gun in rapid succession. The bullets struck the creature, but they seemed to have little effect. The detective realized that he would have to use everything he had to defeat the monster. He pulled out a vial of holy water that he had prepared earlier and threw it at the monster. The water splashed across its skin, sizzling and burning. The monster let out another ear-splitting screech and lunged at the detective again. This time, the detective was ready. He dodged to the side, drawing a silver dagger from his belt. With a roar, he charged at the monster, the dagger held high. The monster was caught off guard by the detective's sudden attack. Its tentacles flailed wildly as the detective plunged the dagger into its flesh. The monster let out a final, pitiful whimper and collapsed to the ground, dead. The detective stood there for a moment, catching his breath and allowing the enormity of what had just happened to sink in. He had defeated the ancient evil that had been terrorizing the town for centuries. He had saved his family and the entire town from certain destruction. As he made his way out of the underground chamber, the detective knew that his life would never be the same. He had faced his fears and emerged victorious, stronger and braver than he had ever been before. The town would always remember him as a hero, the man who had saved them from the shadows within. Chapter 12, The Aftermath. The aftermath of the confrontation and the resolution of the mystery. As the dawn broke, the townspeople slowly emerged from their homes, their faces etched with fear and trepidation. They had all heard the commotion in the town square the night before, and many of them had come to witness the confrontation between the detective and the ancient evil that had been hiding in their town for centuries. The detective had emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. He had suffered grievous injuries in the battle and was now lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by his family and the grateful townspeople. They had come to thank him for saving their town from destruction and to offer their condolences for the loss of his family members who had fallen victim to the ancient evil. The detective was quiet, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. He knew that he had accomplished his mission, but at a great personal cost. He had lost everything he held dear, and he knew that he would never be the same again. As he lay there, he was comforted by the presence of his family and the townspeople. They had come to offer their support and to help him rebuild his life. He knew that it would be a long and difficult road, but he was grateful for their kindness and their unwavering faith in him. In the days that followed, the detective slowly recovered from his injuries. He spent his days reflecting on the events that had led him to this point and the lessons he had learned along the way. He realized that sometimes the greatest victories come at the greatest cost, and that it was up to him to decide whether the sacrifice was worth it. As the weeks turned into months, the detective slowly began to rebuild his life. He returned to his job as a detective, but he was no longer the same man he had been before. He had been changed by his experience, and he knew that he would never be the same again. The town, too, began to recover from the trauma of the past few months. The disappearances had stopped, and the townspeople were slowly learning to trust each other again. They had been through a great ordeal, but they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. As the years went by, the detective became a legend in the town. His bravery and sacrifice had saved them from destruction, and his memory was honored by the townspeople for generations to come. And though he never forgot the pain and loss he had suffered, he knew that he had done what was right, and that was all that mattered. The shadows had been vanquished, and the town was at peace once again. The detective smiled as he looked out over the town he had saved, and he knew that he had done what he was born to do. He had confronted the darkness within, and he had emerged victorious. Thank you for watching Midnight Murmurs. I hope you enjoyed this tale of horror and suspense. If you want more thrilling stories like this, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories on Midnight Murmurs.